Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into two incredible underwater mysteries. But the real story here isn't just about what we found at the bottom of the sea. It's about what our reaction to these discoveries tells us about ourselves. Every so often, the ocean floor sends back an echo, a weird shape on a sonar screen, a story that just doesn't quite fit with what we think we know. And it's right there, in that moment of confusion, that our own imaginations really kick into high gear.
So this all kicked off with this image right here. Back in 2011, a team of Swedish treasure hunters were just doing their thing, scanning the Baltic seafloor, when this popped up on their screen. A blurry, 60-meter-wide circular object. It was symmetrical, it was weird, and it was totally unexpected. But then you have this. A decade earlier, an even bigger, more earth-shattering claim surfaced off the coast of India. Scientists doing pollution studies stumbled upon what looked for all the world like a lost city. And not just any lost city, one that could be thousands of years older than the pyramids.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at these initial discoveries. Then, we'll get into the sensational stories they sparked. After that, we'll decode what the actual scientific data says, uncover a really fascinating pattern, and finally, ask the big question. Why do these strange finds feel so extreme? You see, an unexplained anomaly is like a blank canvas. And when it comes from the mysterious depths of the ocean, our imaginations, and of course the media, are ready with their paintbrushes to create a masterpiece of a story. With that Baltic Sea thing, speculation just went wild. The tabloids immediately jumped on the sunken UFO angle, and it didn't take long for someone to point out, hey, that kind of looks like the Millennium Falcon, doesn't it? And just like that, the story went viral. And this thing had legs, I'm telling you, it wasn't just a flash in the pan. It took a whole year for the story to really blow up in the media, and then it just kept going online for years. You had theories about secret weapons, alien tech, all of it keeping the mystery alive, often with the promise of, hey, maybe we'll go back and find the truth. But the story out of India, well, that was on a whole other level. This wasn't just some weird object. This was a massive, potentially 9-kilometer-long settlement. If that one piece of wood was really connected to the city, it would force us to completely rewrite the timeline of human civilization as we know it. Okay, but what happens when the headlines fade and the media storm dies down? Well, that's when the slow, careful work of science begins. It's time to separate the real signal from all that noise. And wow, does this show you the huge gulf between a wild story and, well, geology? Scientists looking at the Baltic case pretty quickly came up with a much more down-to-earth explanation. They didn't see a spaceship, they saw the footprint left behind by a giant, ancient glacier. You see, a huge part of the problem was the data itself. One expert from the world-renowned Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution even said the sonar image was, and I quote, virtually useless. Why? Because the equipment was cheap, wasn't set up right, and was creating all sorts of distortions. So the very foundation of this whole mystery was, super shaky from the get-go. And the physical evidence? It totally backed this up. A geologist from Stockholm University got his hands on rock samples from the site and found nothing. Nothing unusual, anyway. Just your standard issue rocks that you totally expect a glacier to drag across the landscape during the last ice age. No alien metals, just plain old stone. And you know what's wild? This story in India played out in a surprisingly similar way. It all came down to just a few key pieces of evidence that really needed a closer look. So, let's be clear. The stuff they dredged up from the seafloor does prove that people lived in this area thousands of years ago. No doubt about it. But that extraordinary claim, the one about a huge, organized 9,500-year-old city, well, that rests almost entirely on one single piece of evidence. Just one. That's it. A single piece of wood pulled up from the seabed. It wasn't even carved or shaped by anyone. And that single piece was dated to 9,500 years ago. The entire rewrite history narrative is hanging by that one thread. An underwater archaeologist on Reddit put it perfectly. It's like finding an old piece of wood in your backyard and then declaring that your house must be that old, too. It's a huge logical leap, especially since 20,000 years ago, sea levels were way lower. That whole area was probably just a forest. So, if you lay it all out, what do we actually have? Well, we've got solid proof people lived there. That's a check. An actual city? It's possible, I guess, but the sonar just shows patterns, not buildings we can confirm. And that 9,500-year-old date, it's circumstantial at best, because it's tied to that one random piece of wood. And this brings us to the real heart of the matter, right? If the science points to glaciers and old trees, why are these stories about UFOs and lost civilizations so powerful? Why do we want to believe in them so badly, even when the evidence is thin? Well, believe it or not, the answer might not be at the bottom of the ocean, but way up high in the atmosphere, with a weather phenomenon that actually explains a lot about how our expectations shape our reality. I'm sure you've heard this term thrown around all the time on the news, the polar vortex. It sounds pretty intense, like something out of a disaster movie, but it's not a new kind of storm. It's a totally normal part of our planet's climate that scientists have known about for decades. Okay, picture an ice skater spinning. When she pulls her arms in tight, she spins really fast and stays in one place. That's a stable polar vortex, keeping all that freezing Arctic air locked up at the North Pole. But if she throws her arms out, she starts to wobble and slow down. That's a disrupted vortex, and it can send huge waves of that bitter cold spilling way down south. And this is the key. As climatologist Judah Cohen explains, it's not that these cold snaps are necessarily colder than the ones our grandparents lived through. The thing is, it feels more extreme to us because our baseline, our whole idea of what a normal winter feels like, has been slowly changing. We've gotten used to milder weather. And that's exactly what's happening with these underwater mysteries. They're like a historical polar vortex. The shock doesn't really come from the object itself, but from how badly it clashes with our expectations. A sunken UFO or 9,500-year-old city feels so wild, so reality-shattering, because it messes with the historical timeline we thought we knew. It disrupts our baseline. So the real takeaway here is that sometimes the biggest discovery isn't some object we find. It's what our reaction to that object tells us about our own changing world and our own shifting expectations. It really makes you think, doesn't it? What other things out there feel like huge mysteries to us, not because they're truly new, but simply because we've